before we do that, just very briefly, I just want to give you a piece of good news, which is that the Biographers Club now has sponsorship from Hatchards for the Biographers Club. Yeah, really good news for the prize for the best first biography, and we're really excited about this. And I think that Francis and Mark, who the Hatchards side of this, are also excited, and it's going to be a very good relationship. So thank you all very much. Turning more to actual biographers and biography, Jad Adams is a well-known, well, you're a man of many talents, aren't you? Well, a journalist, an academic, a television producer, an expert on the fin de siècle, and you've published a book, Decadent Women, Yellow Book Lives, which you can buy after this event, published by Reaktions, and you know, an indication of just what an expert you are in that area. So, Jad, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I really appreciate this meeting. Thank you very much to Hatchards and for the Biographers Club for calling it on the onward march of group biography. It is an onward march. If we look at some of the recent books which have been successful in group biography, I'm thinking of Metaphysical Animals by Claire McCumhale and Rachel Wiseman, that's about four women philosophers, Square Hunting, Francesca Wade, Noble Savages about the Olivia sisters, and the Biographers Club has played its part in these group all of these are written within the last 5 years, and the Biographers Club has played its part in the success of these books. Square Hunting and Noble Savages were winners of the Tony Lothian Prize, as was Harriet Baker's Rural Hours. So we have Harriet here to talk about that. Harriet has a PhD from St Mary's, and I'm very happy to say that she has just become a mother just a few months ago. So she'll be running off to domestic life, but they've given her a break tonight. And on my left hand, Leah Broad, who's a research fellow at Christchurch, Oxford, specialising in 20th century music, and her book QUARTET achieves the distinction of writing very well about music, which is a very hard thing to do. So I'll ask a few questions and then invite responses for questions from the audience later, but first of all we'll have a little chat. So if I might ask you first, Harriet, what came first, the theme or the women? Did you want to write about the countryside and look for a way to do it, or did you want to write about these three women and the countryside was something that you could use as a mechanism?
Hello, thank you for coming. It's lovely to be back with the Biographers Club. It seems ages ago since I won that prize. It's nice to see you all again. I think it started with the countryside. I was beginning my MA at King's College London, and I was reading quite a lot of, I suppose, what's called the new nature writing. And I became very interested in books like Olivia Laing's To the River, which blended genres of place writing and biography and history. So I suppose that kind of sowed the seed. And then during the first year of my PhD, I was reading Woolf's diaries, and in the collected edition, there was only the first portion of what's called her Asham diary, which she wrote when she was living at Asham House in Sussex. The diary was the summer of 1917, but a note at the bottom said that a portion for the summer of 1918 existed, but I couldn't find it anywhere. That has now been remedied with Granter's new edition that they brought out last year. The diary's been finally published in full. But it gave me a glimpse into a different Woolf, a Woolf that I hadn't seen at that point. Making nature notes, walking on the downs. She was recovering from her longest and most severe bout of mental illness. So I really began to read this diary as a kind of convalescent writing. And I was interested in Sussex and the other people that lived there, her relationship to her sister, Vanessa Bell, and I write in the book a lot about their kind of affectionate rivalry. And then I was reading Sylvia Townsend Warner, and I went to her archive and discovered a similar kind of unconventional archival text, the kind of text that biographers tend to kind of skip over. What is a shopping list or a laundry list or an illustration of your flower bed? How might that actually sort of reveal the texture of your everyday life? I became very interested in those questions. And so then the book began to shape itself. So it was place, and then the women followed. Rosamund Lehman, I was reading her alongside, and her amazing stories that she published in the early 40s in John Lehman's New Writing, a trilogy of wartime stories. And she didn't, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, she didn't quite fit, and that I found really interesting. But she was the kind of missing puzzle piece that I sort of, I don't want to say I wedged in, but I was quite determined to sort of craft a group story out of these women.
Thank you. How about you, Liv? Did you want to write about the 4 women who are in Quartet, or did you want to write about music and that these women were way into it?
So, hello everybody, and just before I talk about my book, I'm just going to say that Harriet's book is so beautiful. I've been reading it for this, and the way she gets into like the intimacy of these lives and the like granular detail is just beautiful, and something that like in some senses I wished I'd been able to do even more in my book, is get into those like moments, right, where you've just got these span of a few years, but then I've got this huge scope of over 150 years, and so I ended up doing something a little bit different. So I think I sort of a little bit of both. I wanted to write about music of the early 20th century, and I come from an academic background, and I grew up playing the piano, and it just became so very obvious to me when I was teaching, when I'm studying, there are all these sort of big histories of classical music and big histories of British music in the 20th century, and then you start to look for the women. And it's not that they weren't there, it's that they haven't been included in these histories. And these are the books that I was using as teaching texts every day. And my students would come to me and say, Leah, where are the women? And I go, no, yes, it's a problem. And at that point, you know, I think the one that really frustrated me, that it feels really disingenuous to write a history of British music in the 20th century without including Ethel Smythe. And yet it has been done over and over and over again. And I thought, you know what, this isn't fair. And so that's why the book was always going to have Ethel Smythe in it, but Ethel Smythe's one of these characters, for people who aren't familiar with her, she was really unusual for her time, an utterly extraordinary woman. She wrote 6 operas, she was the first woman to be made a dame for her services to music. She also wrote 11 books, like on the side. She was a pro golfer, she was a militant suffragette, she was lovers or friends with everyone, including Virginia Woolf. She was an extraordinary person. But she was totally unrepresentative of what it was like to be a woman trying to compose at that time. And so I didn't want her to be the only person in the book. That's why I wanted it to be a group biography, to show actually there wasn't one way of being a woman and being a composer at this time. Actually, other women found it much harder because they didn't have Ethel Smythe's personality, or indeed her very upper-class privileged background. And so that's why I wanted it to be a group, as well as the fact that all of these women who I write about were sort of isolated by others in their time. When they were written about, they were always referred to as the only, or the exceptional, or the unusual. And so I really wanted to be able to show that that is a myth. Women have always been there, they've always been writing classical music. They've been writing really since the idea of a composer has come into being. Women have been there composing. And so that's why I thought, actually, even though Ethel Smythe should have a big biography of her own, it needed to be more than just her. So a little bit of both. I love the music of all the women in this book. They all had incredible lives, and it feels like there's this gap in classical music history. As I'm looking up at these shelves now, there are not many women except as performers, and that's not the bookshop, it's the books. There we go, there's my feminist pitch.
That's really interesting. As for me, with Decadent Women, what had happened was in year 2000 I finished a book called Madder Music, Stronger Wine, about the decadent poet Ernest Dowson, and it occurred to me that I got in that book an awful lot of comments by men about him, contemporaries of him, people later on who wrote about him, and yet none of the women. And there were a lot of women around in the 1890s who were working at the same level as the men, who were being published at the same level as the men, and who were subsequently forgotten. They simply weren't being reported on later in the 1920s when people were writing their memoirs about the 1890s. And I said, well, I've got this book full of men's voices about this romantic poet, but I haven't got any women's voices. And so I said, I'll find those women, I'll find who they are. And so I started off on something really nebulous, which was going to be called with women of the 1890s, women writers of the 1890s. And of course that was never going to run. That's just much too big. But it gave me an area in which to fish. I wrote a proposal called The Decadence in Love, which I do wish that I managed to get that off the ground, but I did. But finally, I narrowed it down to women who had actually worked on the Yellow Book, and of the people who contributed to the Yellow Book, a third were women, which was remarkable for any publication. So of those 47 women, I just checked out their archives and what biographical writing there was about them, checked out what they'd said, what they themselves had written, and got it down to the 11 who occur in Decadent Women Yellow Book lives. And of those, some are lives like writers live, which are normally not terribly interesting lives, but in all of them there's something exciting. There's one active, hunger-striking, being force-fed suffragette in Evelyn Sharp. There's one adventurer in Many Muriel Dowie, and one of them went to serve in the First World War and died in the First World War, and has a monument to her, Mabel Dearmer. So there were those characters, a number of different people with the same starting point, the Yellow Book, but then they got to went to very different places afterwards. Could I ask again, Harriet, first of all, what are the challenges of group biography as opposed to the single person biog? Does the theme get in the way and stop you from pursuing things that a character might be? You might want to follow a character doing things which have got nothing at all to do with the countryside, but you've got to stick to the countryside. Is it a challenge?
No, I didn't really find that a challenge. I suppose by the time I was writing it, I'd really lit upon 2-year intervals in the lives of each of these three writers. So Virginia Woolf at Ascham in 1917 to 1918, when she's recovering and she begins this very unusual diary. Sylvia Townsend Warner in 1930, when she starts to make a home in rural Dorset with her lover, the poet Valentine Ackland. And Rosamund Lehman in 1941, after the collapse of her second marriage, where she has to sort of downsize, and she's already living in the country, but she lives differently. And so once I kind of lit upon those moments in their lives, fallow periods not necessarily of novel writing, but of different kinds of writing, and domesticity and a creative engagement with domestic life, then the theme felt really set, and I could work with it. There are definitely other challenges to writing group biographies. I think Leah and I have talked about this briefly already. Archives. You might have a really well represented archive for one writer and then a completely different set of archival sources for another. With Woolf, just stumbling upon a portion of diary that has almost no criticism about it is kind of gold dust for anyone in Woolf studies. So I was really, really excited by that, and I kept it very secret for a long time and worked really hard to try and understand it and read it as deeply as possible. With Sylvia Townsend Warner, in the book I propose that this is part of her kind of left-wing project of being a good communist and having a good communist home with Valentine Ackland, but she kept everything, and her archive is, as I've mentioned before, all of these kind of homely domestic texts, which for me really brought to life her experience, the texture of her everyday life. And then with Rosamund Lehman, there was nothing like that. There were copious letters to friends. But the letters that I really wanted to read were destroyed. So in her sort of tumultuous 9-year affair with Cecil Day-Lewis, which begins at the cottage, her letters don't survive. They're his, but they're undated, so that's quite difficult to work with. And she had a very ambivalent relationship with writing, as she did with lots of other things in her life, ambivalent relationship with politics, and she was such an interesting, complex figure to work with. But she was often very lazy. She didn't keep a diary. She often wasn't that productive. She had this kind of sensuous sluggishness, which I really tried to sort of delve into. That's a nicer way of saying that she was a bit lazy. So I had to look elsewhere. But that then became really fruitful. So the diaries of Laurie Lee, which are really beautifully written, they are unpublished in the British Library. And he had a very kind of sticky friendship with Rosamund Lehman during this period and went to stay at her cottage several times. And then by reading his diaries, I began to see her more in the round, as it were. So the fact that he didn't quite trust her, the fact that he didn't know whether she was being sincere, whether she was almost being a bit flirtatious with him. All of that sort of came out in his side of the friendship, which gave me a much more nuanced vision of her at a really uncertain period in her life, where she's embarrassed because of the failure of her second marriage. She's starting a new relationship, but her lover is married, so that's complicated. She's living in much more straitened circumstances in the country, financially relying on her writing. Obviously, wartime, that was challenging. And so by looking to her letters, by looking to her descriptions by other people, I sort of expanded my archival sense. And so each chapter was so different from each other, but I began to craft quite sort of different pictures of them. And one of the things I was thinking about on my way here was the idea that I suppose we haven't really defined what a group biography is, because in a traditional sense, maybe a group biography sort of makes a case for a cause or a movement, or it's often about similarity, drawing comparisons between subjects. And I don't know, in a way, if my book is actually a group biography, because the subjects are so different from each other, the texts that I'm working with are different from each other, and I wasn't sort of advocating for a group or a coterie in that way. I mean, they did loosely know each other, and I was really thrilled when I came across some very kind and encouraging, respectful letters between them, but the kind of respect that showed that they were acquaintances, not friends, in the archives. And what I wanted to do was present their differences. So the idea that it's a clutch of lives, a clutch of rural hours, different styles of living in the country, even though they ultimately, the thread is the countryside, and the thread is the idea that, I should have said this right at the beginning, that they moved there for a short period of time and were transformed by it, that it transformed their private lives and their creative lives. Yeah, I'll stop, but
Thank you.
some thoughts.
How about you, Leah? Is it? I suppose it's a slightly different question here, because these women were musicians, and so the music penetrated every part of their lives, and their lovers tended to be musicians as well, didn't they? But you did get people like Ethel Smythe taking time off the suffrage, and she took 2 years off when she didn't compose any music because she wanted to follow Emmeline Pankhurst.
Well, she said she was going to, and then she didn't. So I think she's very good at saying she's going to do things and then changes her mind very quickly. And yet, I kind of have a similar thing, which is that although they're all musicians, yours are all writers, they're actually extremely different people, and they deal with everything in their lives in incredibly different ways. And that was partly what drew me to them, but also made it unbelievably complicated to write, was the fact that all 4 women had, even at sort of like similar points where they cross over, they also weren't friends, but they did intersect sometimes, and they do wildly different things. There was this wonderful little, I think something, for example, Ethel Smythe and Rebecca Clark. Ethel Smythe was this larger-than-life woman. She just said whatever came into her head. She was very unguarded. Rebecca Clark was born sort of a generation after her, completely different woman. She's very fashionable, very reserved, very careful. She sort of went to all the fancy parties. She knew exactly who she was and how she was presenting herself. But Ethel Smythe went to one of Rebecca Clark's concerts at the Wigmore Hall, and she said to her, "Oh, well, you know, come round for tea afterwards because I adored your music." And I think something that really sums up their personalities is after this Christmas scones and tea, Ethel Smythe wrote to her great niece, "Oh, you know, I've just met Rebecca Clark. She's beautiful, she's darling, she's wonderful, she's everything, and I love her." And Rebecca Clark just wrote in her diary, "Had tea with Ethel Smythe. She's a funny, cracked old thing, but all right, really." I think that just sums them up in a nutshell. And I really loved that. These sort of intersections. And I think actually for me, one of the biggest challenges was structure when I was handling these 4 incredibly different lives. So we've actually ended up going for a quite different way of structuring the book. So mine's entirely chronological. And I think partly I wanted to do that because there was no theme in some sense to the book other than that these women were women and they were composers as well. And so I wanted to be able to show this kind of broad historical sweep in attitudes towards women's work in music and how that changes, and the fact that progress really isn't linear over that time. So Ethel Smythe's born in 1858, Doreen Cowithan dies in 2003. But there's, for example, there's this drop-off after the Second World War. So things are actually going pretty well for women composers in Britain around the 1930s, 1920s. Women are kind of in fashion after getting the vote. And then post-1945, tanks, absolutely tanks, and women's names pretty much disappear from programs, even though with the sort of narrative about the Second World War being positive for women's work, in some ways it was, but for creative women, there was sort of rise in the idea of sort of very conservative ideas about family values, keeping women off programs, really was quite destructive for women composers. So at the proms, it took until 2019 had the same number of women programmed at the proms as there were in 1919. And so it's not that the women were never there, or that suddenly sort of we started making progress in the 21st century, it was that actually they were actively removed. And so I wanted to have this sort of very long chronological scope to be able to show that, because I think if there's a theme that runs through the book, it is how these women have had to deal with extraordinary prejudice. And I think classical music remains very bad in its attitudes towards women, both women who compose, perform, and who write about music as well. And I think that was something that was very difficult to navigate, was getting that broad scope while also getting a sense of who these people were and getting something of the intimacy that you've got in Rural Hours.
Thank you. That's I'll pick up on something there. I certainly felt the challenge of structure in working with a number of people. And so I opened Decadent Women with the launch of the Yellow Book, which was down the road here in Old Compton Street in April 1894. And so that's a good starting point. But it took a very long time to find how you start a book which is going to be about a group of people. And for example, I spent 3 months working on one proposal which didn't do that, which didn't have the right structure. But finally, when I got the backbone of the Yellow Book, that they all worked on the Yellow Book, and that's going to be the point at which they intersect, then it all made sense to me. And certainly it was a joy in the archives sometime, being the William Andrews Clark archive in Los Angeles. Awful damn place, don't go. It's, they're open for about 4 hours a day, and otherwise you have to go over the other side of the campus and eat in their dreadful canteen, waiting for them to reopen the archive. Anyway, so you're sitting there suddenly, finding a letter between two of these women makes just a huge amount of difference, that I've got a connection between them. Certainly archives were a challenge, and I know you were talking earlier, Harriet, about the challenge in your case. Archives were, I had to work out, when I started this work, there wasn't the sort of electronic finding aid that we have now. You didn't tap it on the keyboard. You used to have to go to the big ledgers, which were which were printed where someone's archives were. So you'd find out that George Egerton's archives are in the Princeton, and so you had to, just a few years earlier than that, 5 years earlier, if I'd started this work, I'd have had to write a letter to the Princeton and say, can I come, and then wait for their reply. And at least by the time I'd started, there was email, so at least we got some instant, more or less instant communication. But you had to look in archive, in these ledgers, and find where the archives were. Then find out what was available, if it was worth making a trip, and then make an application for a research grant, all that kind of business. So that working on a number of people meant there were a lot of different archives and archives of different qualities, and in some cases, like Ethel Colburn Main, one of my women, her archives were sold separately. So at the bidding, presumably, when these Americans came and bought up all these literary gems in the 1950s, and our literature was scraped across the green bays of the Atlantic, as Henry James put it. There were obviously people from the Lilly Library in Indiana and from Texas, from the Harry Ransom Library in Texas. Each of them were bidding, because I've got half of this stuff in one library and half in another, and you literally will have one letter in one place and one letter in the following letter in another place. So archives are a challenge, just structure is a challenge, but ultimately what I did was do it chronologically, like as you did, Leah. Once I'd got the structure of the Yellow Book, I then told the women's story chronologically and mentioned when the Yellow Book came in and out of their lives. It didn't last very long, it was only there for 3 years. But I think that the other breakthrough, apart from deciding it should be the Yellow Book, was that I decided it had to be fin de siècle and then commence de siècle. I did the 20th century quite separately. So it's chronological, but the 20th century is a very separate. And I felt that once we'd entered the 20th century, a lot of those advances, steady, slow advances, which women were making in the 19th century, were slowed to a halt. And I found exactly what you found, Leah, in the interwar period. That the women who had been noted, as I mentioned earlier this evening, women had been noted in the 1890s, they were writing at the same level as men and so on. In the 1920s, they're ignored, and the memoirs don't mention them. And that really interested me as a historian, that I think, I'm thinking there's something happening here, or something not happening, and the things that are not happening are often as interesting as the things that do. Let me ask, how do you ensure a balance when there are some characters that have a rich store of biographical material and others don't?
I think I've sort of touched on that already. The idea that I had to look elsewhere and see Rosamund Lane in the round. I sort of feel I've answered.
Okay.
Is that okay?
No,
Maybe
no,
I'll pass
that's
it
right.
to you, really.
No. So you can kind of take the opportunity of a question from me to say whatever you fancy saying.
I can talk a little bit about that if you want, because definitely I had Ethel Smythe, who was obviously going to be the dominant character, not least because she was alive for so long, she just kept going. And then I had also so many people wrote about Ethel Smythe, whereas Dorothy Howland, Doreen Corwithen, there was basically nothing written about them by other people, other than reviews at the time. But I think what I tried to do was, I think it sort of comes back to this question of archives, and that really shaped how I focused on each woman. I kind of just went, okay, I am dedicating the same number of words to each woman, and that is how I'm kind of going to stop this person from dominating, is that there's a point where I'm going to say, you know what, she cannot be 4/5 of this chapter, because I am trying to tell the story of 4 women, and I view each of them as important as each other. So how do I tell that story? And that was really liberating, actually, once I'd sort of cut Ethel down to size a little bit, because something that I found really hard with her is because so much was written about her, and she was a voluminous letter writer, but all her letters have been preserved, but they're in archives across the globe because they're in the collections of people who were more famous than her.
Mm-hmm.
So her letters to Virginia Woolf are in America with Virginia Woolf's letters, and then her letters to Edith Somerville are in Ireland with Edith Somerville's letters. And so it was an absolute nightmare trying to pull everything together, and I'm so grateful to the librarians who digitized all this stuff for me, because I was also trying to do this in a pandemic, and I would not have pitched this book had I known we would be in lockdown. And then Dorothy Howell, she doesn't have any material in official archives or libraries at all. So what is left of her materials is kept in a family home by her niece and nephew. And actually, towards the end of her life, she was so depressed about the fact that her music wasn't being published and performed, she tried to burn everything and destroy it. And it was only her niece and nephew who stepped in and said, "Oh, we'll burn it for you. Just put it in this box." But you can, and it's very like physically tangible in the scores where she tried to rip them up, and some of them have been sellotaped back together. It's chaotic. And her niece and nephew have really done the best that they possibly can. But what was actually turned out to be quite nice about that is that Ethel Smythe curated herself and had the opportunity to try and edit her diaries for posterity and really shape the way she was viewed, but also there was so much mythology around Ethel Smythe that I had to try and cut through and get away from this idea of her as a funny footnote who wore tweeds and was hilarious but not worth taking seriously. I didn't have any of that with Dorothy Howell to try and push past. I could just tell her story as I found it in this house, in these boxes. And she did keep things like her shopping lists, and I thought that was so lovely because it gave me this very intimate view of her that I sometimes found hard to get with Ethel Smythe, because there was so much public image with Ethel Smythe that just wasn't there for Dorothy. So I could talk about her apple pies and things that she loved doing, and the way she took the mickey out of more kind of verbose critics on music, and she used to keep the things she found especially stupid, I think, and would turn them into nonsense poetry, and I rather enjoyed that. So that was a kind of, that's how I kind of balanced it, was going, okay, well, I need to be shaped by what material I have and try and respond to that, I think.
That's really interesting. I certainly chime with that over the detail. I mean, I remember, for example, Sylvia Townsend Warner's thin cotton dress that you describe, and Rebecca Clark's fish and chips that she would get when she came back from the concert, been working on stage, and then it's fish and chips in the newspaper as they were. So I love that sense of detail that you can get, and you can only get if you really do a lot of decent archive work. It's also the case, I chime also with what you say about destruction of papers. Some people actually made sure they knew that I was coming, and they had their papers destroyed. So Ella Hepworth Dixon doesn't have much of an appearance in my book, even though she's a very interesting character who wrote lots of interesting things, but very little biographical information because she burned it. She gave instructions and Netta Siret similarly gave instructions for all her papers and letters to be burned, which is, that they wanted to frustrate our endeavours. I'm glad to say they weren't entirely successful in every case. May I ask, how did you choose those women to write about? The reason I ask is because when I was reading your books, I noticed Liza Layman occurs in all three of our books. She's in there, she's mentioned each time. She doesn't play a big part in any of them. And clearly we've decided, and you particularly have decided, Liza Layman, we're not going to deal with her, we're going to deal with this other four group of women. So, quite, well, good. But, so how did you decide the women that you were going to work with?
Leah has given me a way into the balance question. I think I was being very literal minded when you asked that of me, sorry. So maybe if I answer that, this might answer this question as well. I think one of the things that I found I was working with was the idea that all of these writers carried preconceptions. And so balance, I'm thinking about balance now in the sense of creating a balanced picture of them and working with those preconceptions versus what the archive was presenting, versus my own feelings about them. One reviewer has written of my book that I'm enthralled to these women, and I am, and I'm not ashamed about that. And I think you write in your introduction that you're in love with your subjects as well. Yeah, and I think that can be a really sort of motivating force when you're writing about them. So I think I was lucky with Woolf in that the period that I was looking at is a really unknown period of her life. And so Woolf was my Ethel Smythe. She was the cornerstone of the project, and there is so much that has been written about her and so many knowledgeable Woolf scholars. So that was intimidating, but I'd found my kind of off the beaten track moment of her life. With Sylvia Townsend Warner, she just brings so much. Her archive is so full of her personality and the wit of her letters, the flair of her letters, and the kind of slightly tonally contrasting melancholy of her diaries. And so I really began to see such a full picture of her. Rosamund Lehmann, I feel, has been rather unjustly dismissed by the literary world as a middle-brow novelist, a romantic novelist maybe, and again biographically because of her relationships, and I think her beauty worked against her as well. She has quite a sort of bad reputation, and so in writing that chapter I wanted to reach balance. I took each of these women at their word. So when they were attempting to live differently in the countryside, instead of diminishing that attempt by being cynical, and I think that often happens with in the cases of women trying to live differently, that those attempts are diminished. I saw them as sincere attempts. Am I answering the question that you just asked?
Yes,
can you remind me if that was?
How did you choose the women you were going to write about?
Yeah.
Not other women who'd had some relationship to the country that you could.
Yeah, there were other characters. So Carrington was going to be one of the chapters, but and I'm so glad there's a wonderful exhibition of her life and work this year at Pallant House. But she knew Rosamund Lehmann in the period when Rosamund was at Ipston House, not her cottage in Berkshire, and it didn't quite fit. And there were other people as well. Mary Butts wrote her amazing Ash of Rings novels about Dorset. Dorothy Richardson, who people tend to associate with London, she rather oddly she lived in London in the summer and Cornwall in the winter. I think most people would do it the other way around, but I was interested that, like Woolf, she had this kind of London and country rhythm in her life and work. But ultimately, yeah, the idea that these women, they weren't a group, they weren't a coterie, but they did know each other. And the letters that I discovered between them in the archives just created what felt like a kind of serendipitous and quite beautiful arc. So Virginia Woolf writing to Rosamund Lehmann when Lehmann is an aspiring novelist and Woolf is a very experienced one by that point, and she encourages her. The fact that, anecdotally, Sylvia Townsend Warner met Woolf at a party, and Woolf said, "How do you know so much about witches?" And Warner replied, "I am one," which is a very typically kind of mischievous response from her. And then late in their lives, Sylvia Townsend Warner writing to Rosamund Lehmann. By this point, they'd both experienced huge personal griefs. Rosamund Lehmann had lost her daughter at the age of 25, and Sylvia Townsend Warner's partner, Valentine Ackland, had died in 1969. And so they write to each other about grief and about the feeling that they had somehow to step away from the real world and write about supernatural themes. But they treat the word supernatural in a very kind of gentle way, and they talk about the idea that they'd been ostracised by the literary community and by their friends for taking on these themes and for dealing with their grief in this way. And so they had a kind of respect for each other and encouraged each other in a way that I was interested in. And then also there are similarities, the same kind of socioeconomic backgrounds, the same degree of education, in the sense that they were all, to use Wolf's phrase, the daughters of educated men. They were incredibly well read and erudite, but they didn't attend school. So there are similarities, but enough difference for me to work with. Difference politically as well, which is most interesting in transitioning from Warner's very leftist politics to Lehman's kind of quiet conservatism, which definitely resurfaced in the 40s. Anyway.
Thank you. Yeah. I certainly like Warner better than the others.
Everybody says that, I know. Well, I'm still going to advocate for Lehman, her books, and I would. A secret ambition for this book is to sort of recover her literary reputation a bit. I'd like to send readers to her work.
Please do. How about you, Leah? Why these four?
I mean, writing about 20th century composers in Britain, I mean, there were so many women I could have chosen. Ethel Smythe was always going to be in the book. I think she has to be a cornerstone because she changed things so extraordinarily, and she forced people to sort of, I think, actively confront their gender prejudices in a way that somebody like Leah Broad, so this is a composer who, she was famous mostly as a singer and then as a songwriter. And the thing is that actually there was a stereotype that if women could compose at all, it was only as songwriters, because songs were small and they could handle that, whereas large orchestral works were simply beyond women. There's this, I mean, the thinking was that music was kind of unique among the arts because it required a combination of like rational and emotional thinking. And while women could manage the emotional, they couldn't handle the rational. And this is backed up by kind of Victorian science. And there's a brilliant quote in one book which has stuck with me, which is, "The longer the hair, the smaller the brain," which personally I love. And this in this world, Ethel Smythe goes, "No, I'm going to write operas, I'm going to write orchestral music, and you will blooming well listen to it." Whereas Leah Broad didn't really break that mold for me in a way that I just wanted to be able to show that women were doing this at a time when it was thought literally biologically impossible for them to achieve. Then Ethel, Rebecca and Dorothy in their lifetimes were thought of as the kind of three leading women composers. That awful label. But they also pleasingly wrote very different music. Dorothy was an orchestral composer and pianist, Rebecca was a chamber musician and a viola player, and Ethel Smythe was an opera composer. And then they also had really different personalities as well, so that was great. They formed a natural three. But I wanted to have this fourth composer, and then it was, my goodness, there were so many I considered. But I ended with Doreen because she was a film composer, and that's something that's still seen as a bit unusual for women to do today. Actually, a paltry percentage of Hollywood scores are by women. And I wanted to show actually there was this woman in the 40s and 50s who had a very successful career actually as a film composer. And her life was also very different to the others. So all the women in the book, she was the only one who sort of contributed to her writing out. And she gave up her career to support her husband. And that is a trope that's so common for creative women that I felt that a story of that kind needed to be in there. And she just intrigued me. She was a really difficult personality. I don't think we would have got on at all. So that's why I quite liked having her as the fourth person.
For me, the decision was made to some extent. Once I'd said it's going to be women who wrote for the Yellow Book, then I'd got that 47 women. The question was how do you reduce them? One way was there's almost nothing known about some of them. One woman I still don't even know the dates of, which is terrible. But I wanted to have women who had a biographical story I could tell, so they'd have to have done a bit of life writing, or someone else wrote about their lives, or I could find things out about their lives. They had to have archives that I could plumb. If I didn't have life writing somewhere else, at least I'd be able to get in their archives. So that narrowed the matter down a bit. And I wanted women who hadn't had a book written about them before, because otherwise I felt I'd just be repeating things that other people had said about better known women like Vernon Lee and Pearl Craigie. And I said, I'm going to tell the untold stories, so they'd better be untold stories. I mean, the one exception was Charlotte Mew, who had a brilliant biography written about her by Penelope Fitzgerald in 1984, which was a long time ago, so that's good. But with Charlotte Mew, I had not included her originally, but in my research she kept popping up. There she is in the living room of Henry and Aline Harland in their at-home literary gatherings in the Cromwell Road, and there she is in John Lane's tea parties in Vigo Street, and there she is in Paris, staying with Ella Darcy. So she's always somewhere, and I thought, and also she's a talent of unquestioned ability. So I couldn't really leave out Charlotte Mew. I felt that she was just standing there, this kind of plaintive, diminutive figure, saying, "What about me?" So, you're in. Let's see if there are questions from people here. If this has stimulated any thoughts, anything you'd like to ask any individuals or all of us for that matter. Please, Jay.
I just wonder, is group biography a medium only for women? I mean, do you get group biographies? And if so, why?
I don't really read them, so yeah, I think I've pursued. I think I've determinedly pursued reading group biographies by women and about women, and yeah, I think a bit like academics that cite other women academics in their footnotes. I think that's part of a kind of broader methodology or sort of principle that's emerging in my work. So yeah.
I think that's a really great question, partly because it touches on something that really bothers me, which is that Beethoven gets a book on his own, but Ethel Smythe won't, because of the practicalities of selling copy, because she is not as famous as Beethoven. Publishers will go, okay, well, how can we incorporate more people so there's more of a story, and that is resting on basically the back of decades, centuries of gender prejudice that means that the women aren't as well known, so they do get put into group biographies. And so, having said that, I adore group biography because I think it allows, for all the reasons we've been talking about, it's a really beautiful medium and it allows you to do so much. And I think if I ever end up writing about any male composers, I'd love to do a group biography, because I think as a format it does allow you to do so much. But I'm also super aware of the fact there are more group biographies of women, and I think that is partly a negative thing, and to do with people just not knowing who these people are, so they won't pick up a book with just one name on the cover, and that's a real shame. Having said that, what I'm hoping is that these group biographies will actually make it possible for people to then, like the number of people who've said to me, please either write a full biography of Ethel Smythe or have a film made about her, and I'm like, yes, that's the way we do it. And then hopefully somebody else will then go and write a solo biography as well. So I think they're different things, but I think I just really raise that as an awareness in the background.
I absolutely agree with Leah that it's a continuation of a neglect that had continued throughout the 20th century, that these women were ignored to such an extent that now there's no name recognition, and so you go to a publisher asking for saying, I'd like to do this really interesting woman, a fascinating thing, and she's only woman that's had have a war memorial dedicated to her, and that sort of thing, and there's just no name recognition. A publisher will the perfectly intelligent people, publishers, readers will say, yes, this is great, it's really interesting stuff, but we can't sell it, we can't shift it because the name isn't known. And so, as Leah says, one way of getting around this is to put a number of people together and sell the theme.
Well,
yeah.
so I was going to say, Leah, that although you say it's partly negative, I think it's also very positive, because it does inspire people like you to be to find these themes and develop them alongside and around the actual lives that you're writing about. And I think it's been a rather exciting development in recent biography, that people aren't just going for individuals, cradle to grave, but they're absolutely taking they're looking at lives in a more granular way and teasing out the sort of larger themes that those lives fit in with or illuminate. And I think it's a rather exciting development, actually. Just to put the other
I agree with you, and I think that we're also at a very exciting moment in the medium of group biography, in that there are some really fabulous experiments happening with the form itself. So for me, I think thinking about a group biography allows me to take the kind of creative leaps that I might not with a cradle to grave biography. So in thinking about sort of interleaving these women's lives, I went for a sort of snapshot technique, 2 years in the lives of each, but then they all meet again at the end. And the idea that I know I sort of argued against the idea of a group previously, but the idea that a group biography allows there to be a sense of community, and other writers have taken that to such interesting places. I don't know if anyone's read it, but Selby Wynne Schwartz's After Sappho, which is the most amazing creative attempt at taking lots of scholarly and archival research, but then essentially writing a novel in which all of these historical sapphic figures meet, and it's just really wonderful. Fleur Yeagy's These Possible Lives, which actually is a group biography, 3 male poets, a very, very imaginative approach to the form. So I think the idea of it being a group, I feel kind of loosened from the burden of a single figure biography, cradle to grave, and then it sort of makes me think about constructing these lives in a completely different way. And there are so many good examples of that at the moment.
Yeah, please.
I mean, do you think group biography is to the detriment of just straight one-person biography? I mean, having been a reader for the first biography prize, there were so few just one-person biographies entered last year.
Really?
So I'm sorry to say this word, but how fashionable do you think this is at the moment?
I think it is fashionable, definitely. A sort of publishing phenomenon, definitely. But I like where it's going in more kind of creative attempts at the form. But there will always be a place for, I'm just thinking of Heather Clark's amazing biography of Sylvia Plath. There is always going to be space for the definitive. Francesca Wade has written a brilliant essay about the idea of the definitive biography. But there will always be really remarkable single person biographies.
I'd say exactly that, right? And like if we look at the biography shelves that we're surrounded by, right? Like I don't think the solo biography is going anywhere, and they're just two completely different beasts. They allow you to do different things, and as you're saying, like the group biography allows you to think thematically in a way that the solo biography doesn't encourage necessarily. And actually, I think there are probably a lot of writers who are kind of like, gosh, what an exciting thing that's open to me now. I can do this thing and publishers are interested in it. Great, I'll try that now. And it will get less fashionable in a while, and yes, these things go up and down. But I doubt that the single author and single focus, single subject biography will go away.
Please.
For each of you, did the book end up as you had envisioned it when you first set out to write it?
Nope. No, not remotely. And I think the book I'm writing at the minute as well will not end up at all how I thought it would originally be.
I'm just going this way there.
Yes and no. Mine got smaller in a way that I became quite excited about. It was originally going to have more characters, and it was originally going to ask bigger questions and give a kind of broader history. I think because I was studying for my PhD at the time, I had a real sort of feeling that I needed to acknowledge context and sources in a very particular way. And once I kind of unhooked myself from that academic framework, I realised that actually I didn't need to justify myself so much. And so I sort of thought, actually I'm not going to give a historical overview of the 1930s. that's been done. There are places that readers can find that. I'm really just going to write these 3 narrow snapshots in the private lives of these women, and that's where the group form. I felt very kind of loose and free doing that, so it shrank in a way that I was very happy with. Yeah, that's a good question.
It's a very good question. Yes, my poor agent had to deal with 2 extensive proposals from me and try to sell those to publishers before I finally got one that actually that actually worked. So yeah, I envisaged the book quite differently originally, but having got the yellow book as the spine to connect my women, I thought then I was motoring. I knew what I was doing.
Mm.
Please, yes.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely great idea to get the stories of these women much better known. I mean, everything you've said about women is absolutely true. I write about women in politics, which is exactly the same things that you said. But ultimately, do you feel that what you've done has actually raised the profile of these women? And do you think a lot more people know about them than knew about them before you wrote the books?
I've had lots of really lovely comments from readers saying that they have rushed off either to reread Lehman because they read her many years ago or to buy her books for the first time. And I think one of the brilliant things about a group biography is that so many lovely booksellers have in the, your rural hours is on a table, and then around them they put the novels of Sylvia Townsend Warner and the novels of Lehman, and so readers can really sort of dip their toes into their work. So I think it's early to say. Anecdotally, I think a little bit, yes, I hope so. I was thinking, reading the introduction to your book, is there a Spotify playlist? Have you done one of the work?
Yeah, so actually, like, a big motivation for writing this book was to get the music performed. And because it's been out a year now, I can kind of go, okay, has this done anything? And actually, I've been so encouraged by the number of performances of these 4 women has shot up in the last year. It's been so exciting to watch. So now there is the world premiere recording of Ethel Smythe's second opera, De Walt. Tick, we've done that. We've now got the world premiere recording of Dorothy Howe's orchestral works out. Tick, done that. And I've been doing sort of, because it's really hard. I'd love to be able to walk into a bookshop and kind of have the work around it, but it's so hard with music when you're kind of going, oh, well, you've got to buy a book, but then you've got to go to Spotify or go to a concert. So I've been doing kind of presented concerts with music from the book, and we've given the modern premiere of Dorothy Howe's violin sonata. Like, we dug out this piece that hadn't been taken out from the Royal Academy of Music Library since it was published. Since the 1940s, and that's the piece of music that people afterwards were like, wow, that's what I wanted to hear. So actually, I'm hopeful that reading this will lead people to the music and does make people, I hope, realise actually there's so much music like this. This is just 4 women, but my God, there's so much music out there that we could be listening to that is super exciting. And yeah, keep your eyes out for the Proms programme coming out soon. There will be, I think, might be a good year.
Great news. It's really good to hear that
yeah.
a positive story coming
yes,
from
hooray!
And your book was out last year, which is why we've got a paperback now. So it's a bit early to be able to tell, but certainly with some of the women in Decadent Women, the reviewers have said things like, why don't I know more about this woman, and we've got to read something of this woman, and people have said it to me, so that's anecdotal. I've got no actual evidence, but I may well be approaching some publishers and giving them a little push, people like Persephone, and saying, how about getting some of George Egerton's work out, because she's an amazing modernist. One more question, and if there isn't, well, that's a very good note to end on anyway. Thank you, Leah. Let's have some performance. Yes.
Yes, and thank you all 3 of you for such wonderfully eloquent and articulate discussion. which could go on probably for much longer. And please come and continue the conversation. Come and buy these marvellous books. I can vouch for them. They're fascinating. And have a drink. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
All three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.